And we might kick off now. So welcome everybody. My name is Lauren Kerrison. I work for the Tasmanian Chamber of Commerce and Industry as a WHS facilitator. Today we are lucky enough to have guest speaker Sharon here from Kentish Regional Clinic. I just ask that everyone please place themselves on mute, and if you do have any questions, pop them in the group chat, and Sharon has allocated some time at the end for any questions as well, but I'll let her introduce herself and about the business and what she'll be going through today. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet on in our respective places here as traditional owners and continuing custodians of the land, and including elders past and present and any people that might be in the room as well. So I'm the CEO for Kentish Regional Clinic, and I'll go through the programs that we run. We started here in Sheffield 20 years ago. We started our cause community-owned response to eliminating suicide. Started here in Sheffield in response to some suicides, 10 suicides over a 3-year period, and the community said we're going to do something about this, and they started our suicide prevention program 20 years ago. So we've got 20 years experience as a grassroots organisation, empowering communities and individuals, as well as services and other areas. I guess I think this education is important for everybody, in workplaces and everywhere else. So, really important work. So we lose 9 people a day to suicide in Australia. So that's, pretty high stats, really. That was our first program, because we've added to that over the years. So my background is I was actually born in Cobar in New South Wales, and I moved to Boulia. You'll see there on that map, which is 200 miles from Mount Isa and 100 miles from the Simpson Desert, so pretty outback country. And growing up, I was very confused about my gender identity, because I always thought I was a boy and people thought I was a girl. So there was some confusion around that. And of course, that's pretty tough country out there. And I'm 57 this year, so not much was known about it, about trans in those days, which I was many, many years, spent 20 odd, perhaps close to 20 years before I found that term myself. So, I really struggled with my gender identity. I've got words for that I didn't have, of course, when I was 3 or 4 years old. So I came to terms with that pretty much by myself, because any calls for help were sort of squashed and seen as ridiculous, and I learnt to hide those things. When I came to terms with my sexuality, I found that I was actually attracted to girls and not to boys, which made some sense to me, but it didn't make sense to the girls in Boulia, and there was a fair bit more confusion went on there. So, growing up in reality in the most homophobic place in Australia, I moved to Tasmania in my early 20s, which is the second most homophobic place in Australia, and it's very relative. It's interesting. I took my partner back to Boulia years, just this year, in fact, for the Boulia camel races. And it was interesting going back there, and the heteronormativity and all of that stuff. And people really don't have an understanding. They think sexuality is all it is, and they don't see the gender identity stuff. So I really struggled through that until somewhere in my early 20s, I saw transgender, and I thought, well, this really fits for me. And I looked to transition in my early 20s, and then I'd made a decision not to transition, because even then, and we're going back 30 odd years, I decided that I was non-binary, and I didn't have words for that, but I just felt like I wasn't quite male and not quite female, and I didn't fit that expectations of male or female. And I grew up with family violence as well, so that sort of compounded some of my issues. And then as I went through, so I was suicidal by the time I was 12. So quite an interesting journey, which is why I when I sorted a lot of this stuff out for myself with a bit of help from some of the some of the professionals I've seen, but I didn't see professionals till I was in my 20s. So when I sorted out for myself, I sort of decided I'd dedicate my life to working in LGBTIQA plus inclusion, lesbian, gay, transgender, um, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer as the new term, and asexual intersex communities. So and also suicide prevention. So this was a really good fit for me within the organisation I work for now. So when I came across, we run two programs. We had the HIPPY, which is Home Interaction Program for Parents and Youngsters, which is an early learning age 3-4 program. And then we added to that, then the cause, of course, was the first program we had. And since I came on board about 6.5 years ago, we added in the LGBTIQA plus professional development, and then took over Bi Plus Australia. So yeah, my background's, I guess, a fair bit of lived experience in that field. So when I went on after I sorted some of that stuff out, and I spent 6 years as an educator counsellor for Working It Out, which is sexuality and gender support and education. And because I decided when I worked things out for myself that I really wanted to support people, and I wanted to be a counsellor and support people to come to terms, because I felt like people really do need support around that stuff. And, and I thought it was really important. But what I found, it was an educated counsellor's role, and I really liked the education. So, I really was, I thought the education is really, I think that people often are uneducated around these subjects. It's not that they're necessarily, even though there's some horrific outcomes from some of the treatment of LGBTIQA plus people that are experiencing suicidality or mental illness. It's really around a lack of education and a lack of understanding. And I myself didn't have much of an understanding growing up in outback Queensland. It's kind of the sort of country where you know, you you know, you just take a bag of cement. If you've got any problems, take a bag of cement and just toughen up. And of course, that doesn't work. We all know that, I hope. Here in Tasmania, we're certainly, we look more to get support. So, CAUSE aims to educate individuals and communities in suicide intervention and develop community networks to eliminate suicide. So I'll take you through some of our programs now. CAUSE Australia is a not-for-profit, non-government organisation established in 2003. We've got programs running in Queensland, South Australia, just from little Tasmania and Sheffield. I guess Tasmania leads the way in a lot of things as well. So that's important to remember for us that are Tasmanians here today. And yeah, so Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. So, and we've trained people from every state and territory in Australia in the last 12 months. So that's pretty good. During COVID, of course, we got into the online training. So I'm a big fan of face-to-face training. I think that's the best way to go. But, it's really important that we can get into other areas with online training as well. So that's all of our programs are online now. So we run the self-care and mental wellbeing online. Our suicide prevention training, which is a one-day training, is online, as well as we're just launching our LGBTIQA plus training online. There's a first session on the 6th, 7th and 8th of November. So our suicide prevention training takes you through the introduction to suicide, exploring suicidal thoughts and behaviours, looking for signs and indicators. It's a full-day training, assessing the level of risk, considering appropriate interventions, drawing up agreements and safety plans. And our online training is 3 2.5-hour sessions. So if you do that, it's via Zoom. So it's an interactive online training, and it's 3 2.5-hour sessions. And finding and using community resources is also a really important aspect there. We use the River of Risk, which is a great model for looking at the top there below the dam wall. We look at our tributaries, so the tributaries there, and then our dam wall. So the tributaries are our everyday stresses that may lead to those feelings of overwhelm. And then we look at the dam wall as our coping skills, our resources and supports. We go through the river of risk as where thoughts of suicide will occur. We've got our fast current where 1 in 10 people will quickly move from thoughts to action. And they're the people that we often can't support. And then we've got the eddies where 9 in 10 people moving closer and further away from suicide. And that's the real opportunity that we have to support people. And then our waterfall for where suicide attempt or death by suicide occur. So we look at the National Communications Charter, and this language around suicide has been ever evolving and ever changing. And I've worked in the field for nearly 20 years, and I really struggle to keep up. So I don't know how anyone else does it out there in the community as well. But hopefully, the National Communication Charter is a unified approach, and certainly, things shows us what to say and what not to say. There's some good ones there also around mental illness, and some really good information on the National Communications Charter. Now, Tasmania has its own communication charter as well, so you can actually click on the link and go into the Tasmanian Communication Charter and get some other information in that there as well. But, things like commit suicide, that associates suicide with a crime or a sin. And I know people that have lost someone to suicide, and I know I worked with a lady that had lost her son to suicide over 20 years before, and she'd never got support. And she actually went. She ended up going to a counsellor, and the counsellor actually said commit suicide, and she said, "Well, I'll never go back there again." And that was really sad because she'd taken so long to go to a counsellor, and then the counsellor said commit, and straight away you are judging my family and judging my son, and so she disconnected. So really important that we know that when we sensationalize or glamorize suicide, that that leads to more suicides, and that's really important that we and it's something that we can just learn. I know a lot of us have suicide. Political suicide was certainly one that I had to change because I use that term a bit, and it's certainly an inaccurate use of the word. So some of those sorts of things we go through in the day. We actually look at we go through the CHIME model, where we look at connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment, and that's a really important model. When we look at connectedness, we look at having peers, good relationships, supports from, and these are the protective factors, of course, for people experiencing mental illness or at risk of mental illness and also of suicidality. So support from others, being part of a community. And we look at hope, optimism about the future, believing in recovery, motivated to change, positive thinking, and having aspirations. We're looking at identity, having a positive sense of yourself, dealing with stigma, and knowing what makes you who you are, which I can really relate to in my journey of sexuality and gender identity around this CHIME model. Really makes a lot of sense to me. And then our meaning in life, making sense of mental illness, having a good life, rebuilding your life, and having purpose. And I think this CHIME model works for everyone. I think if we're all humans, and I think we all need to keep in checking on our CHIME. And also about empowerment, being responsible for your well-being, being in charge, focusing on strengths, facing your challenges, and owning your own struggles. So so that training session runs, as I said, for a whole day, and we go through a lot of that. We go through the community attitudes to suicide as well, and because it's the community attitudes that create the stigma and shame around this stuff, which makes it harder for people to reach out for support when they need it. Early intervention, to me, early intervention's the key. I first done the cause training in 2007, so I was very early on, and that training actually helped me to understand my own struggles and why I was spent a bit of time swimming in that river, as you'd say. And it helped me to understand. And the self-care and mental well-being strategies from that model are strategies that I'll use forever, because there's some really good strategies which we took. That river of risk also goes into our self-care and mental well-being training, which is the 2-hour session. So some really good strategies in there to utilise. And we with Kentish Regional Clinic, which sounds like a doctor's surgery and it's not, and I think it came over from Tandara Health when they started Cause, and we kind of got stuck with it. Sometimes we're really a training organisation in lots of ways and community development. So, sounding like a doctor's surgery only helps when we're wanting to do training in GP practices, I suppose, and health services. But, we're sort of just stuck with it there. But, yeah, really important. I think that if everyone was trained in suicide prevention skills and self-care and mental well-being, I think, we'd really see a real reduction in rates of suicides within this country, which is something we're aiming for, obviously. When we look at some feedback we had from people regarding the training. I was in a training session recently, and someone actually said they actually brought some of their clients in to a training session, and they said that they would like to thank Sharon and Cause for helping me save my daughter. My daughter and I attended your suicide prevention training, and it helped her to see that she was not weak or selfish. It helped us to work together to develop safety plans and agreed boundaries for support. Sharon and the team, you're truly lifesavers. Thank you. So really important feedback. So our self-care and mental well-being 2-hour workshop, we go through what is self-care and mental well-being. We identify personal stresses and struggles. We look at physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual self-care and mental well-being strategies, and we learn to recognise and identify our supportive people. We identify a list of community resources. That's really important. People often don't know the resources that are in their communities, and when we brainstorm it, we really come up with a lot, and it's really valuable for people. And they develop a personalised self-care and mental wellbeing plan. So they basically get an A3 sheet and they go through and put down what their own tributaries are. We've all got tributaries, and then they look at what is in their dam wall when they're the supportive, protective factors, and what they do to relax and de-stress and cope with what everything that's going on. So it's really important when we look at those self-care strategies around the physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual. Often we'll find that we draw heavily on, one or two of those, and people will often say, at the end of the training, they'll say, I can see that what I've been doing was really physical and mental, but the social and, and the emotional sort of stuff, I've not really, I really need to build on. And, or they'll say, well, look, I've, doing 4 of those, but the social thing is what I'm not doing, and then look at some strategies, and they'll put those strategies in their dam wall there and then, to look at as well. So I think that it's really important when we're looking at mental well-being that we look at all of those. So that's the dam wall, which is an A3 sheet that people go through. So it might be family, peer pressure, illness, relationships, work, social media, of course, is a big one these days for younger people. And then their dam wall might be music, meditation, dancing, reading, talking to a friend, praying. Then that'll be different for everybody. So what would be a coping skill for me might be actually a tributary or a stress and a struggle for you. So it's really important that when we're looking at this, we're looking at what works for us and putting that into play as well. And people take that away, and it's sort of a work in progress, so you can sort of keep adding to it, and which is really valuable as well. So some participants' feedback there was, I've lived with mental illness for most of my life. I've been to psychologists and psychiatrists and been given lots of information over the years, but I've learnt more usable information today than I got from all of these things. And that was a self-care and mental wellbeing participant aged in their 60s, and that was really interesting feedback very early in the training sessions that we got. the magic of five supportive people is something that we all, I think we could all take something from. And when I was working with Daniel Whithouse from the National Institute for Challenging Homophobia Education, Daniel went around Australia mapping homophobia, and he found the difference between people that were surviving and thriving in those regions in rural and regional Australia was the magic of five supportive people. So when Daniel started talking about that, it was interesting for me because growing up with family violence, I didn't really learn trust. And Daniel was saying about five supportive people, and I was kind of like, well, I'm not so sure about that. But I had a grandmother who was a really amazing person. She grew up in Backer in a place called, in Cobar, where I was born, in fact, and but she was a Catholic as well, and but she was one of those people that never judged anybody. One of those, what I'd say, a true Christian. She never judged anyone. Sometimes people would be gossiping as they do in small towns, and someone would say, oh, someone's going to jail for this or they did that, and Gran would be saying there, but for the grace of God go I. She was very genuine. And when I came out, and I came out in my early 20s as transgender, and Gran just said, well, we made a mistake and Sharon was a boy, and she called me he and him ever after. And just an absolutely amazing person. And I thought to myself, if I'd have had five of my grandmother, how much different my life might have been. So and I could see that this was a real thing. And so I started banging on about it, and I was actually talking at Walking Out of the Shadows for Lifeline in Hobart, and someone come up to me afterwards and said, "Who are your five supportive people, Sharon?" I went, and I'm a pretty quick thinker, so I sort of went, well, there's Lifeline, and I would never ring Lifeline. It's just not my thing to ring somebody. It's not my preferred option. I didn't say that. I just said, well, there's Lifeline, and I said, there's Rural Alive and Well. I know I could ring someone from Rural Alive and Well, and they'd come to my door, and I wouldn't even have to leave home, and that seemed like a better option. So that was something I went away with, and I went, right, that's what I'll do. If I need support, I'll ring Rural Alive and Well. And I went away from there, and I gradually worked on. During COVID, I've actually got five supportive people on one hand and a couple of service providers on the other. But it was a really important step for me for my own mental well-being is those five supportive people, because when I was struggling, what I found was that I had huge internal resilience. So when I was struggling, I was down there by myself in that deep dark hole, and I had to clamber back up by myself as well. But with five supportive people, what I find that as I reach out, I had to learn that external resilience, that learning to reach out and get support from other people. And for me, it's usually when the voices in the back of my head start saying, you're stupid, you're useless, you'll never amount to anything, that I just want to spend time with someone that I know that cares about me, or someone that I know that believes in me. And, so I reach out before I go down that deep, dark space. So that's been truly life-changing for me, that five supportive people. So everyone in the room, I'd like you to think about who your five supportive people are. And if you're like me and you don't have any, or you've only got one or two, that's okay. Look at what you've got and build on it, really important. So happy staff, we like to think about that here. A happy staff make a productive and a happy workplace as well. So it's good to think about, the mental well-being of our staff. And yeah, and we do, make time for, self-care and mental wellbeing training, and that for all of our staff here at Kentish Regional Clinic, because I think it's really important, and it also shows that we value them. But even, even productivity from people that are happy and, supported in their workplace, you just have such a better workplace, really. So it's a really important aspect. And I know I had a situation once, I've been in management a fair bit of my life, and I can remember, we were flat strap. I worked and managed a rural supply store, and we were flat strap all the time. And anyway, one of my staff was, used to really, really a really good staff member and a good hard worker, but occasionally things would get to her, and you just watch her productivity drop and drop and drop. And one day I was like, right, I suppose we better go and have a coffee, and we'd sit down and have a cuppa and a chat, and she'd be, her output had probably dropped to maybe 70% of what she would normally produce in terms of work. And then we'd go and have a coffee for an hour, which had really almost be a counselling session, and then we go back to work, and she'd be back to operating at a normal 100%. And I just thought, even if we didn't care about our staff, which we always have within the workplaces I've worked, the absolute productivity of our staff when they're supported and to have those conversations and sort out some of those things. And they might be big things going on for them, but they can accumulate if they've got nobody to talk to and nothing, nowhere to go with that. So our LGBTI, providing an inclusive practice and community for LGBTIQA plus people. We have information to assist individuals and organisations to be inclusive and welcoming for LGBTIQA plus people. We go through the LGBTIQA plus definitions and pronouns, additional information on the needs of transgender and asexual people, current LGBTIQA plus specific research, and research from Bi Plus Australia as well. And we have a screening of Intersection. And Intersection's a really powerful documentary. Although it was filmed in 2012, the World Health Organization and Kentish Regional Clinic still use it as a training tool. So it's intersex people from all over the world telling their stories of growing up as intersex. So a lot of those people were born with ambiguous genitals, so they weren't sure whether they were male or female. And then they had a lot of them had surgery as well to normalize that. And it's a really powerful documentary around intersex stories. And one thing about that, I find that most people that if they come to a training session thinking that there are only two genders in the world, and and that often people think that, they don't think that when they've watched Intersection. It's just a really powerful tool. Lived experience is something that we use a bit, which is why I share some of my story with you as well. And sometimes during the training sessions, when we do the 2-hour GP practice or 1-hour sessions and that sort of thing, we draw heavily on lived experience because that helps to educate people, I guess, around some of those challenges for people. And thinking about our own workplaces, do you have out? Not that people have to be out. That's but we want our workplaces to be comfortable places to be out if they feel safe to be out. And we know that probably 20% of the population are LGBTIQA plus. So you'll fall into that. So if you've got a workplace of 100 people, there could be 20 LGBTIQA plus people in your workplace. So if they're not out, they're there. So often people are making assumptions around some of that. And bisexuality and asexuality are quite invisible. So and less out as well. So we go through the gender-bred person as well. So that's where we look at identity, attraction, sex, and expression. And it's people often, because the LGBTIQA plus community get wrapped up into one acronym, and it's sexuality and gender identity are very, very different. And as I mentioned to you when I was in Queensland, I think that Queensland still don't get gender identity, and there's a fair bit of confusion around the gender identity stuff because sexuality and gender identity are very, very different. Yeah, they're as well. So it's really important to remember that. And people, if they change their gender and they transition from male to female or female to male, they usually don't change their sexuality. So it's really not connected. They're under the same acronym because they experience higher levels of mental health issues or mental illness and suicidality. That's the reason they're lumped into the one acronym. But there's a lot of difference, of course, between sexuality and gender identity. So we go through that. The gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and who we're attracted to sexually, romantically, and we also talk about socially attracted as well. So we had, interesting, we had some feedback from some participants. I learnt a lot in today's session, but personally I realised that I am agender. So sometimes people come along to the training and, just sometimes to work out, who they are. And I had someone, they were all service providers at a training session recently, and one of them said, my partner said, when I'm doing the training today to work out what I am, because we haven't really labelled ourselves. We're just two women that love each other and live together, and we haven't looked at our labels. And that's an important aspect as well, because some people don't want to label themselves, and I'm a big fan of of labels are for jars, and I want a time where we don't have to worry about labels. But I do acknowledge, and it's really important sometimes for me when I was struggling and I first come to terms with the fact that I was different when I found transgender, it was like there's a label I can go that I belong and there's more people like me. So that can be important for people to work out and for whatever their labels are. But again, it's really important that we don't label people and people choose their own labels. That's one thing that I'm very that everybody that's a common feedback that we get. People really want to label themselves, not have other people labeling them. When we looked at the current research, um, uh, the Private Lives 3, over 6,835 LGBTIQ participants surveyed in 2020. 39.5% reported experiencing social exclusion, 34.6% verbal abuse, 23.6% harassment, such as being spat at or offensive gestures, 11.8% sexual assault, and that was up from 2.9% in 2012. 3.9% physically assaulted with a weapon. There are strong links between homophobic abuse and feeling unsafe, excessive drug use, self-harm, and suicide attempts. So really important to remember these stats are still too high. So Private Lives 3, 60.5% being diagnosed with depression, 47.2% with generalized anxiety disorder, 41.9% reported that they had considered suicide in the previous 12 months. 74.8% had considered suicide at some point during their lives. 30.3% reported having attempted suicide at some point in their lives as well. So in the last 12 months, 11% of participants aged 16 to 17 years had attempted suicide, in contrast to 3.8% of the people aged 16 to 17 years in the general population. Only 38% of participants who had experience in suicidal ideation, planning, or suicide attempts or self-harm in the past 12 months had access to a professional counselling or support service. So really important that people know that services are inclusive and that they can get support. We're still not getting enough people actually reaching out for support. So another participants in our training said, I'm asexual, but because I'm in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex, I'm invisible and people erase my identity. This is really upsetting and I'm afraid to come out in my workplace. And that was interesting. That was actually at a conference presentation that came up. And and they expressed this to me in the break. And they said, there's lots of jokes and negative stuff around sexuality and that within my workplace. And, when I say something, people will say, well, because I'm asexual and I'm married, they think, that I'm not part of that community. And if I say anything, they'll say, well, you're not one of those, so what do you care? And really important that those sorts of jokes and that don't go on in workplaces. And at the end of the session, the second part of that session, somebody said to me, what makes a good ally? And I said, well, a good ally is when people don't have to stand up for themselves. When someone says something and then someone else that's not LGBTIQA plus will jump in and say that's not appropriate. And we've got to look at our safety when we do this stuff as well. If it's in a pub where people are drunk and you say something, you can get into a fight, and that's not useful. But especially in outback Queensland. But where it's safe to, it's really important to jump in. And I had an experience of that when I was in a pub here in Tasmania, and someone up the other end of the bar said that should have known better. Actually said, talking about homosexuality, those priests ought to know better because there's so many of them in the church. And then someone else that I know is an ally, because they'd said to me that they were heterosexual, but they were an ally, and they actually stepped up and said, before I could say anything, which was good, and said, look, I'm going to stop you right there. What you're talking about is pedophiles within the church, and it has nothing to do with sexuality or gay men. So that's, they shouldn't be mentioned in the same conversation. So it's really important that, that we actually stop those things. And that lady that said that said, yeah, that's true. Yes, I know that, that was, poor wording. And she did know better, and she shouldn't have said it. But, someone else pulling them up is much better than me having to pull them up, because if I say something and I would have said something, it would have had more of an impact on me being within that community than it would for an ally that, that hasn't got that other stuff behind it. So another session we had, a participant said, I'm a gay man and my niece identifies as bisexual. We thought she was a lesbian, but I now understand that she's bisexual, and I will support my family to understand this too. So, as I said before, we actually took over. BiPlus Australia was started by Dr. Julia Taylor as part of her, after she did the biggest bisexual research study in the world. And, that was nearly 2,700 people from across Australia. It was around mental illness and suicidality in bisexual populations. And she went on then to start BiPlus Australia. So, there's a lot of research and data on there, and as one-on-one counselling for bisexual community and their families, which is a fee for service that and there's an e-learning module on there that doesn't connect to PayPal yet since we took over. Julia Taylor started that, Dr. Julia Taylor started it, and she, life got in the way, and she eventually decided that she didn't have time for it. And I said, well, we're happy. Kentish Regional Clinic are happy to take it over and take it forward as you had planned it, and that's what we've done. So our wait time on counselling is it's under a week, which is good. When we look at some of the wait times on services these days, it's really good that at present we don't have a high wait time on counselling there. So intersection DVD, as I said, yeah, it's a 68-minute DVD that goes very quickly because it's got those lived experience stories. So it's a really powerful tool for those. And I know it's only in the last 20 years that I learned about intersex, because I wouldn't have understood what it was, even though now I think that I probably have an undiagnosed, or the experts think I've probably got an undiagnosed intersex condition myself. So it was something I'd never heard of. So it's probably one of the least understood of the LGBTIQA plus when you look at talk nationally. People often don't understand intersex, and that's a really good documentary to understand that. As I said, it was filmed in 2012. But to a lot of the things that still go on for intersex people, like surgery, there is some cases where you have to do surgery. On small children because it's life threatening, but very rarely do you have to do that surgery. It's usually something that, intersex people are really clear that they want to grow up and make those decisions around surgery on their bodies rather than those decisions made for them as young people. So a participant recently said, until I saw the intersection DVD, I didn't understand the importance of the changes to the birth certificate legislation. Now I can see that it was essential. And we'll all remember, if we were in Tasmania at the time, the stuff around the birth certificate changes, and that was life-changing for, trans and non-binary people, not having to have surgery, in particular trans people. So I hope we've all seen the equality and equity. I guess the idea is equality. Everybody gets a box to stand on, so that's all, equal. But equity, really, some people need two boxes and some people don't need any. So it's really important that with equity that people get the resources they need and not just be treated equally. There's another one of those now that they take away the fence entirely, but the workplace safety person in me thinks, how does that stop you from getting hit by a ball? But I suppose, and the safety of the players. But I've seen that one as well. I think it's inclusion or something. They take away the barriers entirely, which is not a bad thought either. So talking about allies, I think within LGBTIQA plus communities, allies are really important. So, using inclusive, we talk about that, using inclusive language, identify and learn, show you care, and call out discrimination. I think that, calling out in discrimination where you can safely do that's really important as well. So when we're looking at LGBTIQA plus inclusion, people say the least helpful actions and behaviours are making assumptions, labelling people. I've talked about that a bit. Asking overly personal questions. It's really important that that we don't ask overly personal questions of people. Judging relationships. That's unhelpful. Dismissing and erasing people's identities and experience. And around erasing people's identities, that'll often happen. Someone will say, and I've heard it so many times, oh, they identify as bisexual, but they're in a relationship. They're a woman in a relationship with a woman, so they're obviously a lesbian, or someone's been married and had children and then came out later as a lesbian, and then people will say, and then goes on to live that lesbian life, and people will say, well, they've been married with children, so they're obviously bisexual. Well, they're not. Often people, a lot of gay and lesbians married and had children back in, back in my era. Even there was that real push to get married and have children, and people were often knew that they were lesbian or gay, but they got married and had children, or got married, because they thought they had to, and then didn't really come to terms with their sexuality so much till later, but were really clear that they were always. But that's again where, dismissing and erasing people's identities and experiences is really important not to do. When we look at the most helpful actions and behaviours, is allowing people to define themselves, normalise and assisting with self-acceptance, asking appropriate questions, taking concerns seriously, and supporting LGBTIQA plus diversity. So within our training, the 2 hour, it always amazes me when I look at the information afterwards, but for our 2 hour self-care and mental well-being training in the last 12 months, we've looked at the stats, and we have a 50% increase in knowledge. We assess the knowledge at the beginning of the training, they self-assess their knowledge, and then at the end of the training, and there's a 50% increase in knowledge in a 2 hour training. And I think that that's amazing that, you can think, people can improve their knowledge that much in 2 hours. Our full day suicide prevention, our LGBTIQA plus training, we had an average increase of 65% increase in knowledge over those full day trainings. So, and almost everyone identified they would do something differently as a result of the training. So there was, within that we have questions around what would you do differently as a result of the training, and most people come up with at least one thing that they'd do differently, and they come up with it, at least one thing that they, that they didn't know before the training as well. So we do work from a peer support model. So most of our training is, learning from the participants and that as well. So, interactive sort of training, so that we can, we don't come there as all the knowledge in the room. There's plenty of knowledge in the room that we can share information and that as well. So that's a really important aspect of our training as well. So the other thing about I'm talking about here around those stats and that LGBTIQA plus people are a high suicide risk group. There's nothing about their sexuality and gender identity that makes them a higher risk group, except the environment we live in. So if we change society, we fix that risk to that community. So, they're a high risk of mental illness and suicide. But there are many people living happy, healthy lives out there. I'm sure we know some as well, and I'm sure I'm pretty confident that they'll have the 5 supportive people around them. So what we're talking about here is the pointy end of it all, but really important that within our workplaces and that we have that that opportunity to support people to be who they are as well. So creating those healthy, happy workplaces is really important. So another participants from the LGBTI training said, really pleased that it was run by a peer, much more impactful as well, that lived experience aspects from the intersection, and the other stories we share are really important. And I think that realistically, we need to come back to the idea that it takes a community. We need to come back to that place. Services are stretched out there. We know that. So we need to come back to where it takes a community to raise a child, and it takes a community to support an adult. That's a really important thing. And through joint social action, we can create a better world for everyone, including our minority groups out there as well. So, you know, those high risk groups as well, really important. So, so we've come up to the time now, for question time. So, I've talked quite a bit, so thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. I've unmuted myself as well. So I've just checked the chat and no questions have gone in there yet. But if anyone would like to unmute to ask any questions, or feel free to place them in the chat. Now is a good opportunity to ask Sharon.